In 1914, Britain controlled a quarter of the world's surface. By 1976, it was begging the International Monetary Fund for survival money. What happened in those 62 years wasn't just the loss of an empire. It was financial suicide, dressed as patriotism. And the strangest part? The people who destroyed it thought they were saving it. The cost was £4 trillion in today's money. The method was simple. The consequences were permanent. And almost nobody talks about the real reason it happened. Before 1914, Britain didn't just have an empire. It owned the financial system the world ran on. The pound sterling wasn't just currency. It was the currency. Gold moved through London. Trade settled in pounds. Countries borrowed in pounds. Britain didn't need to conquer with armies anymore. It conquered with debt, interest rates, and access to capital. The City of London controlled more wealth than entire continents combined. This wasn't power built on luck. It was built on 200 years of industrial dominance, naval supremacy, and the careful construction of a financial system that made everyone dependent. If you wanted to trade internationally, you needed pounds. If you needed pounds, you borrowed from London. If you borrowed from London, Britain controlled your economy. It was the perfect trap. Invisible, efficient, unbreakable, or so they thought. But there was a problem nobody wanted to admit. The entire system depended on one thing: confidence. Not military strength, not industrial output, confidence. The pound only worked as the world's reserve currency because people believed Britain would always honor its debts. The moment that belief cracked, the entire structure would collapse. And in August 1914, that crack appeared. When World War I started, Britain faced a choice. It could fight a limited war, protect its financial position, and let continental Europe settle its own disputes. Or it could commit everything, burn through its wealth, and hope to win before the money ran out. Britain chose total war. Not because it had to, because it believed it could afford it. The government estimated the war would cost £1 billion. Expensive, but manageable. They were wrong by a factor of 10. By 1918, Britain had spent over £10 billion. In today's money, that's roughly £1.4 trillion. More than the entire national wealth accumulated over 2 centuries of empire. But here's what made it fatal. Britain didn't pay for the war with wealth. It paid with debt. Every shell, every rifle, every ship, every soldier's salary was financed by borrowing. Britain borrowed from its own citizens through war bonds. It borrowed from the United States. It printed money and borrowed from the future. The national debt went from £650 million in 1914 to £7.4 billion by 1919, an 11-fold increase in 4 years. The pound, once backed by the largest gold reserves in the world, was now backed by promises. And promises don't buy ships, they don't pay soldiers, they don't rebuild shattered economies. The war ended in 1918. Britain won, but the victory was hollow. After the war, Britain tried to return to the old system. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war value. It seemed like the right move. A strong pound meant a strong Britain. But the economy couldn't support it. British goods became too expensive. Exports collapsed. Unemployment soared. Deflation crushed businesses. The country that once controlled global trade couldn't compete with America, Germany, or even smaller industrial nations. And the debt? It never went away. Britain was paying interest on £7.4 billion while trying to manage an economy that was no longer the world's largest. The United States had taken that position during the war. The financial center of the world had shifted from London to New York. And it wasn't coming back. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone knew. The empire was running on fumes. Then, in 1939, it happened again. Another European war. Another impossible choice. And once again, Britain chose total commitment. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, knew what was at stake. He'd seen the cost of the First War. He understood the debt trap. But he also knew that losing to Nazi Germany wasn't an option. So Britain borrowed. Again, this time, even more desperately. The United States provided loans through the Lend-Lease program. Britain sold off overseas assets. It liquidated investments. It spent everything. By 1945, the national debt had reached £21 billion, 3 times the country's entire GDP. In today's terms, roughly £2.6 trillion. The combined costs of both wars? Over £4 trillion in modern money. More wealth than Britain had accumulated in its entire history as an empire. And this time, there was no recovery plan. There was only survival. Here's what most people don't realize. Britain didn't lose the empire because of independence movements or moral awakenings. It lost the empire because it couldn't afford to keep it. And the country that now controlled Britain's survival was the United States. In 1945, Britain went to Washington asking for a loan. Not as an equal, as a supplicant. The United States agreed, but with conditions. Britain had to dismantle its system of imperial trade preferences. It had to open its markets. It had to accept that the dollar, not the pound, would be the world's reserve currency. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 made it official. The dollar was now backed by gold. The pound was backed by dollars. Britain had been demoted from the center of global finance to a secondary player. The empire that once controlled the world's money supply was now dependent on loans from its former colony. The irony was almost poetic, but nobody in Britain was laughing. Over the next 30 years, the empire disintegrated. India gained independence in 1947. Africa followed in the 1950 and 1960. The Middle East, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, all gone. Not because Britain chose to leave, because it couldn't afford to stay. Every colony cost money to administer, defend, and control. And Britain had no money. It had debt, mountains of it. The government tried to maintain the illusion of power. It kept military bases. It tried to influence global politics. It spent money it didn't have on projects it couldn't sustain. The pound kept losing value. Devalued in 1949, devalued again in 1967. Each time, the government promised stability. Each time, the currency weakened further, and then came 1976. By 1976, Britain was in crisis. Inflation was out of control. Unemployment was rising. The government was spending far more than it collected in taxes. The pound was collapsing on international markets. And there was no one left to borrow from, except the International Monetary Fund, an organization Britain had helped create 30 years earlier to help struggling economies. Now, Britain was the struggling economy. The IMF agreed to a loan of $3.9 billion, but the conditions were brutal. Britain had to cut government spending, it had to raise taxes, it had to accept external oversight of its economic policy. The country that once dictated financial terms to the entire world was now taking orders from an international bureaucracy. The empire was dead. The illusion was over. Britain was just another debtor nation, struggling to pay its bills. Here's the part that makes this story dangerous. The mechanism that destroyed Britain wasn't unique. It wasn't a one-time accident. It's a pattern. Empires don't collapse because they lose wars. They collapse because they finance wars with debt. They print money to cover the gap. They devalue their currency. They lose their financial credibility. And once that credibility is gone, the power goes with it. Rome did it. Spain did it. France did it. Britain did it. And the strange part? Every empire thinks it's different. Every empire thinks it can manage the debt. Every empire believes it will find a way out. None of them do. The United States today holds the world's reserve currency. It finances its military with debt. Its national debt exceeds $36 trillion. It prints money to cover deficits. And it believes, just like Britain did, that it's too powerful to fail. Britain's mistake wasn't fighting the wars. It was believing that financial power could survive unlimited borrowing. The empire fell because the people in charge confused military victory with economic sustainability. They thought winning wars would preserve the system. Instead, the cost of winning destroyed the foundation the system was built on. The £4 trillion wasn't just money. It was credibility, independence, and control. And once those were gone, no amount of military strength could bring them back. The British Empire didn't end with a battle. It ended with a loan application. The world's most powerful nation became a debtor state because it chose short-term survival over long-term solvency. And the truly unsettling part? Most of the people making those decisions genuinely believed they had no other choice. But there's always a choice. Pay now or pay later. Britain chose later, and later turned out to be far more expensive than anyone imagined. The warning signs were there. The numbers were clear. The pattern was obvious. They just refused to see it. History doesn't repeat, but the mechanisms do. And right now, those same mechanisms are running in the background of the global economy. You just have to know where to look.